The grand hall of the Valoran Empire stretched beneath crystalline domes that filtered the light of 3 suns into ribbons of amber and violet. Lord Kravik stood at the center of the assembled nobility, his forearms crossed in a gesture of supreme confidence as he addressed the gathering. Today marks a new era of cooperation between our empire and the humans of Earth, he announced, his voice echoing across the vast chamber. As a gesture of goodwill, I present my daughter Lysa to Captain Michael Torres of the Human Diplomatic Corps. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The other nobles shifted on their platforms, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. Lysa stood beside her father, her pale blue skin catching the filtered sunlight, her eyes downcast. She had not spoken a word in 12 cycles, not since the accident that had claimed her mother's life. The Silent One? Lord Vexer called out from his elevated position, his laughter sharp and cruel. Surely this is meant as an insult to our new allies. More laughter joined his, echoing off the crystal walls. Kravik's face darkened to a deeper shade of purple, but he maintained his composure. Captain Torres stepped forward, his human frame small compared to the towering Valorans around him, yet he moved with quiet dignity. "I accept this honor with gratitude," Michael said, his words translated through the neural implant all diplomats wore. He looked at Lysa, meeting her eyes directly, and offered a slight bow. "If Lady Lysa is willing." The assembly fell silent, waiting for the inevitable awkwardness. Lysa could not respond. She had not responded to anything in years. Healers had examined her, declaring her mind intact but her voice irretrievably lost, locked away by trauma too deep for their technology to reach. Lysa raised her head and looked at the human. Something in his eyes, a warmth she had not seen in the calculating gazes of her own people, made her lift her hand and place it in his. "How touching," Vexer sneered. "A mute bride for a primitive species. Perhaps they deserve each other?" Michael ignored the comment, gently guiding Lysa toward the transport platform. As they departed, Kravik stood alone, watching his daughter leave, his expression unreadable. The journey to the human diplomatic vessel took 3 days. During that time, Michael made no demands of Lysa. He showed her to comfortable quarters, brought her meals himself, and spent hours in the observation deck, simply sitting nearby as she watched the stars shift past the viewports. On the 2nd day, he began to talk. Not to her directly, not requiring response, but simply sharing thoughts as one might speak to the universe itself. "My grandmother didn't speak for 5 years," he said, gazing at a nebula in the distance. "She saw things during the resource wars that broke something inside her. Everyone told my grandfather to move on, to find someone else. He refused. He learned to listen to her silence, to understand the language of her presence. When she finally spoke again, the first thing she said was thank you." Lysa turned from the viewport to study him. He did not look at her, did not demand acknowledgement. He simply continued, "I don't know what you've been through. I won't pretend to understand Valoran culture, or what it means to be given to a human, like some kind of token. But I want you to know that here, on this ship, you're not a gift or a gesture. You're a person. And persons have choices." He stood and moved toward the exit, pausing at the doorway. "If you want to return to your father, I'll arrange it. If you want to stay, you're welcome. If you want to go somewhere else entirely, I'll help you. You have 3 weeks to decide before we reach Earth. Whatever you choose, I'll respect it." The door closed behind him, leaving Lysa alone with the stars. On the 3rd day, she found him in the ship's small garden, a modest space with plants from a dozen worlds. He was tending to a struggling Terran rose, adjusting the soil composition with careful attention. Lysa watched him work, noting the gentleness of his movements, the patience with which he coaxed life from reluctant roots. She stepped closer, kneeling beside him. He glanced at her, smiled softly, and offered her a small tool. They worked together in silence, and for the first time in 12 cycles, Lysa felt something like peace. The weeks aboard the ship became a revelation. Michael's crew treated her not as an exotic curiosity, but as a fellow traveler. The ship's medical officer, Dr. Ellen Price, examined her at Michael's request, but made no promises of cures or fixes. "Trauma isn't something we can simply override," Ellen explained gently. "The mind protects itself in ways we don't always understand. If and when you're ready to speak, you will. Until then, there's no shame in silence." Michael taught Lysa about Earth, showing her images of oceans and mountains, of cities that sprawled and forests that whispered. He taught her to play chess, communicating strategy through moved pieces and patient demonstration. He never treated her silence as a deficit. In turn, Lysa began to teach him about Valoran history, using the ship's holographic systems to display images and text, building conversations without words. She showed him the beauty of her homeworld's crystal caves, the complexity of her people's mathematical arts, the tragedy of the wars that had shaped her civilization. One evening, as they sat in the observation deck, watching Earth grow, larger in the viewport, Michael spoke quietly. "I want you to know something. What your father did, giving you to me like property, it was wrong. I accepted because I saw the look in your eyes and thought maybe you wanted escape. But you're not mine. You never will be. When we land, you can go anywhere you want. Be anyone you want." Lysa turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. In that moment, she made her choice. They landed on Earth 3 days later at the diplomatic complex in Geneva. The reception was formal but warm, with human officials greeting their new Valoran guest with genuine curiosity rather than mockery. Lysa felt the difference immediately, the absence of calculated cruelty that had permeated her father's court. But the peace was short-lived. On the 5th day, a Valoran delegation arrived, led by Lord Vexer himself. He strode into the complex with his entourage, demanding an audience with Captain Torres. "We've come to retrieve Lord Kravik's daughter," Vexer announced, his tone dripping with false courtesy. "There are questions about the legitimacy of this arrangement. Some suggest the captain coerced her, taking advantage of her disability." Michael stood firm, his jaw set. "Lady Lysa is free to return if she wishes. I've made that clear from the beginning." Vexer's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. "Then let her tell us herself." "Oh, but wait. She cannot speak, can she?" "How convenient for you, Captain." "A silent witness to whatever arrangement you've made." The assembled diplomats, both human and alien, shifted uncomfortably. Lysa stood beside Michael, her hands clenched at her sides. She could feel the trap closing, the familiar sensation of being rendered invisible by her own silence. "The lady will communicate her wishes through written statement," a human official began, but Vexer cut him off. "Written words can be fabricated? We demand verbal confirmation. Unless, of course, the captain has something to hide." Michael looked at Lysa, his expression apologetic, knowing he had put her in this position by accepting her father's offer. She met his gaze and saw genuine concern, genuine respect. She saw a man who had given her choice when no one else would. She thought of her father, standing silent as the nobles mocked her. She thought of 12 cycles of silence, of being dismissed and overlooked, treated as broken rather than healing. She thought of Michael, sitting with her in the garden, teaching her that silence could be companionship rather than emptiness. Lysa stepped forward, directly in front of Vexer. The Valoran lord towered over her, his expression smug. The room held its breath. She opened her mouth, and for the first time in 12 cycles, she spoke. "I stay." Her voice was soft, rough from disuse, but clear. 2 words that shattered the silence, my crystal breaking. The room erupted. Vexer stumbled backward, his smugness replaced by shock. The human diplomats broke into excited whispers. Michael stood frozen, his eyes wide. Lysa turned to face the assembly, her voice growing stronger with each word. I stay with Captain Torres, not as property, not as a gift, but as a person making a choice. My father gave me away because he saw me as worthless. This human saw me as worthy of respect. In 12 cycles among my own people, no one offered me what Captain Torres gave me in 3 weeks. Dignity. She looked at Vexer, her gaze steady and unflinching. Tell my father I am grateful for one thing. His shame in me led me to discover that silence is not the same as having nothing to say. I simply needed someone willing to listen. Vexer and his delegation departed within the hour, their mission a failure. Lord Kravik, hearing the news through official channels, sent no response. But 3 months later, a small package arrived at the diplomatic complex. Addressed to Lysa. Inside was a crystal from her mother's personal collection, wrapped in traditional mourning cloth, and a note in her father's hand. Your mother would be proud. So am I forgive an old fool his blindness. Lysa kept the crystal on her desk, a reminder of where she came from. But when people asked about her story, she always told them it was not about silence ending or voices returning. It was about a human who understood that the greatest gift one person can give another is the freedom to see.